Hey everybody, how's it going? So here's a brief lecture from me to you about Chapter 7 on gathering materials, research, essentially. Um, yeah, I'm sorry we weren't able to meet at all this week, but hopefully will provide you a little supplementation. Um, when we think of research, very often it's easy to think of it as just a, boring, dry exercise that's only useful for, writing papers and giving speeches and things like that. But really, it's a useful skill, and hopefully, this brief uh, lecture can give you an idea of how it might be useful more broadly than that. It's a great way to make a lot of different life experiences richer, more full, more complete, more interesting. I used to take students on tours of various kinds in Greece, and we'd go to the Acropolis, and you know, thousands upon thousands of people as tourists every year go to the Acropolis, most of which get up there, they think, wow, this is kind of impressive, the view is really nice, they take a bunch of pictures, they walk around, they leave, and it's lovely. But they have a relatively superficial experience because they don't know what any of this stuff really is beyond the superficial. So, um, you know, 5-10 minutes of preparation for, or 20 or 30 minutes for an experience like that, and all of a sudden, so much more of it is so much more interesting. You see things that relate to philosophy, to architecture, to history, that touch on modern things that relate to your own life that you never would see unless you have that experience. Similarly, research really useful for a job interview. If you're going to apply for any job, the ability to know about the company before you go can really set you apart. Also, it's just incredibly useful for teaching yourself about anything you want to know. There's a general cliche that, in an undergraduate education, it's not so much that you learn your subject as much as you learn how to learn. You learn how to teach yourself stuff. So hopefully this can be of use in that regard. Um, for our purposes, I also want to say, just to start off, that the average person, generally speaking, the way they do research for something like this is pretty ineffective. What they tend to do is just do a Google search for whatever their topic is, and generally speaking, the average person tends to just look at like the first page of Google results. And as we'll touch on here in a second, much of the stuff in that first page is paid ads, right? People are on the first page because they paid to be on the first page, and they've optimized to be on the first page, not because they're actually the most reputable source of information, the most credible, objective, accurate, current, any of that. So that's not a good way to do research, in other words. So let's cover some basic ways you can. For your purposes at ACC, I highly recommend you start on the library website, library.austincc.edu. In other contexts, you'll have access to others. You can do similar things through the Austin Public Library, but what you want to do is start with libraries, and in modern times especially, is about using databases. You have access to so much more in a confined space with a database than you do in a Google search or just any sort of random search. In your text, they talk about specific databases that you can use for newspapers, for academic sources. So for newspapers, they mention ProQuest, they mention LexisNexis Academic, they mention World News Digest. All of these, if you're looking for things that you might find in a newspaper, these are good places to go because you're searching through tons of newspapers over many decades, all in one spot. Way more effective than if you're just going from, the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to specific newspapers, websites. If you're looking for more academic information, in your text they mention the JSTOR database, and Google Scholar. Even if you were planning to just Google something, Google Scholar is a better way to do it. You're going to get more high quality results. what do we really mean by high quality results? That's really, I think, at the heart of this chapter. How do we evaluate a web source? And they talk about three critical factors in your textbook that I want to just highlight briefly. I think overall, though, the fundamental attitude needs to be generally one of skepticism, right? Is not accepting at face value a single source, especially when it makes a dramatic claim. Many people have said this. I think of it as being a line from Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist. Bold claims require bold evidence. The bigger and more expansive the thing that you're saying, you're claiming, the more in-depth and overwhelmingly clear your evidence needs to be for that thing. So yeah, be skeptical, especially of dramatic headlines for starters, right? So the three criteria they use in your text to talk about evaluating web documents are authorship, sponsorship, and recency. So what are we talking about here? Authorship, we're talking about who's the author and what qualifies them to speak. Sponsorship, we're talking about how this was funded and how it came to be published. And recency, we're talking about the timeliness, how up-to-date is this source? How recent is it? How accurate is it in that regard? So with authorship, first, who is the author of this piece that you're looking at? It should be there. If it's not there, that should get your hackles up, making you a little bit suspicious. If you have the author, who are they? What do they have some kind of expertise? Either professional experience, academic experience. What qualifies them to speak as some sort of an authority on this subject? If you're not sure if they're an expert of any kind, do a quick Google search of their name. Right? Very often that's going to turn up something about their credentials if they're in some way qualified to speak on the subject. Not always, but often. If there's no author to cite, as in the case of there are some publications where they might purposefully not include the author because they want that to be anonymous and to focus specifically on the publication itself. That can happen, but you can find that out, right? But generally speaking, the author is critical. For your particular speeches, I just want to remind you, you have a minimum of three sources that you need to cite. I would point out that that's a minimum, but you can do that by having at least one for each of your main points. I think if you want to do really well and get an A, you're going to want more than that. But that's the minimum requirement is three sources. When you cite those sources, you need to include the publication, the date, and the author in every citation you give, right? So, for example, publication, date, and author. According to the New York Times from August 1997 in an article entitled "What's the Economy Doing for You?" by Joe Smith, author and publication, author, and date, right? So there's the publication. According to this article by this person from this time, right? The order isn't really important, but you need all three pieces. What's the publication called? Who's the author, and what's the date? This may be utterly redundant and not useful to you, but don't say, I found this on the internet. Don't say, according to the research. Now, what research are we talking about here, right? Be specific, cite a source, or don't make a claim, okay? When I'm listening to students give speeches, very often without realizing it, they're giving information and they don't cite a source. And in my mind, whenever you make a claim in your speech, I'm thinking, says who? This disease is a major problem. And I'm thinking, says who? This affects lots of people. Says who? Who does it affect? I don't say this affects lots of people. Say, in 2019, this many people in this place and in this time were affected in this way, according to this source. Be specific, and you'll be a lot more credible as in informative or persuasive speaking. So who's the author is the number one criteria for evaluating web documents. Number 2 is sponsorship. So obviously this is huge, right? What we're looking for here is essentially, is there some sort of economic conflict of interest? If you're not familiar with that term, right? Conflict of interest is if you're giving me if you're the sponsor, you're paying me the money, then I'm often in some way beholden to that sponsor to portray them in a favorable light, right? This is the thing we talk about if you want to do a speech, either informative or persuasive, about campaign finance reform. Really important subject, not a really sexy subject, but a really critically important one. How can we trust politicians to try and make the best decisions they can when they are beholden to their campaign donors, right? If some large organization or person has been giving you tons of cash to run your campaign, how can we trust you to not vote in their favor when it comes to time to do that? So if you're not sure about the sponsors of an organization, search the organization, right? As I said about authors. What do you find? Do you find that there's any credibility that's in doubt? Often you'll see that in the first page or two of search results about that organization, especially if it's not one that you've heard of or know much about. Generally speaking, with authorship and with sponsorship, if you're referencing something in a speech, unlike in a paper, right, we need that citation when you give the information. You don't want to give the information and then way later in the speech say, oh, by the way, my source is this. We don't know what information that you used in your of all this stuff you mentioned. We don't know which pieces of it came from that source. So when you mention the information, give the citation then. If you then reference the same source again later, you can reference back to, you can say that same article by so-and-so, or you can say that same article from the New York Times, whatever the source is, right? But you don't have to give the whole citation every time you reference it, but you need to reference it, okay? Third criteria is recency. So we've got authorship, sponsorship, and recency. How recent, how up-to-date is this information? What you're looking for here is a copyright, a date of publication, a date of last revision on the website. These are critical, okay? Especially if you're giving any kind of statistics, right? You gotta know that those statistics are up to date. You don't want to be giving inaccurate or out-of-date statistics. Out-of-date statistics are inaccurate in so many contexts. Essentially, don't cite an undated source. It's just that simple. If you don't have a date, don't cite it. Don't use it, in other words. Don't just use it and not cite it. But don't use it. You need that date in order for it to have credibility. If you can't find a date on a source that you like, that you're looking at, you may need to just find a new source. But sometimes, you have to hunt a little bit to find the source, but critical to getting credit for what the research you've done, establishing your credibility with your audience. Last thing I want to touch on, and then we'll wrap up here, is they talk about some research tips in your textbook in the chapter. So first thing they mention is starting early. If you're trying to research your subject, a day or two before you do the speech, you're kind of digging a hole for yourself, right? You're making it that much harder. I know it's easy to procrastinate, but just a little start to get the ball rolling will make a huge difference. I think with so many things, right, in life. I'm notoriously bad at procrastination, or good at procrastination, depending on how you want to frame it. Start early, start gathering your materials early. One of the big things they mention I want to highlight in your text from page 131 is taking notes consistently. So when you're looking stuff up, don't just read stuff and then save it or just sort of skip around constantly, right? Have a piece of paper in front of you and take notes consistently. On page 131, they have an example of how to do it. It's really simple, the way they describe it, but it's really useful in making your notes and making your research a lot more straightforward and easier for you to manage. So they just, putting a heading at the top. What's the subject heading? In this example, it says Global Flu Pandemic. And then having an abbreviated citation, right, like the author's name and the title of the article. right? Maybe the publication as well, and then thirdly, having the note about whatever piece of information you're taking from it, and noting, am I using a quotation? Am I paraphrasing it? Or is it my own idea, right? Just putting that out to the side. So the heading, the citation, skip a space, the citation, skip a space, the brief note that you're making, right? And then when you open up your notes, it's really easy to see what's what. It doesn't just look like a jumble. I know that might seem insignificant and unnecessary, but you take a bunch of notes, you go back a week later or 5 days later or whatever, you look at it, and it's not easy to read. It can be discouraging. It can make the whole thing more frustrating when it doesn't need to be. I say this as somebody who's had problems with organization his whole life. It's very helpful. So yeah, just to clarify, right? Gotta make sure that if you're giving a direct quote, you say so, and you say quote, the word quote before you give the quote. If you're paraphrasing, make sure that you're still giving credit, right? That you're not plagiarizing, which we've talked about a bit. And make sure your paraphrases are accurate. Don't interpret the thing in your paraphrase. If you're giving a paraphrase and then citing a source, it needs to be what they said that you're paraphrasing, not what you think about what they said. You can say what you think about what they said, but you have to not say that in the paraphrase. You can't put words in the mouth of the author. Okay, and the last thing I would just include is sort of they mention this in your text. Sort of think as you go. Many people can look at research as sort of a rote task where you just sort of, okay, I found something. Here's what it's called. Here's the thing. Next one. Here's what it's called. Here's the thing. And they're sort of just going through the motions. Process it as you're going, and you can sort of begin to craft the speech or the paper or whatever it is in your mind as you're creating it. Right? Not perfectly, but you kind of are thinking about, where can I put this? Where might this fit? What does this connect to that I've seen previously? So that's generally the gist of what I wanted to cover today. I also want to remind you the supporting materials we've discussed that you're looking for. We've got facts and statistics. We've got examples. We've got testimony, either from an expert or someone else perhaps. We've got stories about individuals specifically related to the subject, and we've got definitions, right? Facts and stats, examples, testimony, stories, definitions. The sorts of things that you're looking for to support your speech. If you have questions about any of these pieces, feel free to shoot me an email, or better yet, just wait till class so everybody can hear your question, because I'm sure it's probably one that other people have too. So yeah, don't just do a Google search of your topic. Do these things. Go to the library website. It'll make your speech, your paper, whatever you're working on, a lot more high quality, credible. And you can use this to just enrich any experience you're having. There's something you're about to do you're interested in, especially stuff that you're really interested in. You want to understand it. These sorts of research tips can lead you to more accurate, more objective understanding of the subject, rather than just the sort of people trying to sell you stuff that you run into constantly online. Okay? I will see you next class. Thanks for listening, and sorry again that we weren't able to meet today. See ya.